Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. We up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Welcome to a new series of Family Stories, the podcast written by you, our listeners. This week's Family Stories take us from an enduring friendship between a prisoner of war and a member of the Land Army to a rare wartime sighting of Mahatma Gandhi, and then back to the Blitz and the tale of someone's missing fingers. We begin this week with a story from Karl Walls. My mother was 14 in 1944 and was in the Land Army, living in West Derby in Liverpool. She was working in a field, and in the next field there were German POWs working the land. One day, my mother fell into a bog while on the field and was quickly sinking up to her waist. She was crying out for help. When a POW in the next field heard her cries, he immediately risked being shot and ran to her aid. Using his spade, he passed it to her and she grabbed the handle. He pulled her from the bog. After that, he was allowed out of the camp every week and went to her house to have Sunday dinner with our family. He made a jewellery box for her, which she kept until her death. I think my sister has it now. On the day the POWs were removed and sent for repatriation, the convoy went down the road where my mother lived. The whole convoy came to a halt whilst he was allowed out to go and say goodbye. That was the last time they ever saw each other. My brother, Robert, is named after him. And that was from Karl Walls.
Our next story is from William Boyton. My granddad Dennis joined the Royal Navy in the early 1940s and was posted on a corvette to counter Japanese submarine operations in the Indian Ocean. He was lucky enough to get ashore in India a number of times. He was used to the green fields of Essex and said he couldn't believe how hot and dry it was. One day he was sitting at a train station on the platform, somewhere in southeast India. He was with one of his officers and was reading his book. He noticed a lot of people immediately in front of him following a man with glasses on and wearing some sort of robe. He recalled them laying petals in front of this man. He thought nothing of it at the time and kept on reading his book. His officer turned to him and said, "Do you see who that was?" Grandad replied that he had not. His officer smiled and said that it was Gandhi. My granddad had heard of him in the newspapers, but still thought nothing of it. We were discussing Gandhi in the mid-2000s, and my granddad proudly recounted, "I saw him in person." He seemed very pleased he did. Grandad Dennis passed away in 2011, and that was from William Boyton.
Our next story is from Steve Callahan. My grandfather grew up in a tiny coal mining town in central Pennsylvania, one of many siblings in a large Irish Catholic family. When he became old enough to join the army in 1943, he was sent to New Orleans for his initial training, likely the first time he had ever left the state. His girlfriend at the time, also from that same small town and from a large Catholic family, agreed to marry him while he was in training. Like him, she had never travelled far. She told her mom she was going to stay with friends, but actually boarded an overnight train and made her way to New Orleans to marry my grandfather. It's hard today to really understand how brave it was to travel alone as a young woman to a faraway city in the deep south. Shortly before he departed for Europe, my grandmother gave him a picture of herself. He carried that picture with him throughout the war. I remember one night when I was home from college in the 1990s, he and I sat on our back deck drinking some beers. He told me that when he was in the UK, when he could get leave, he liked to visit a local pub, but he'd always take a Canadian with him because they were great in a fight that would inevitably break out. We believe that he served as a firefighter and was likely attached to some British unit. We know he landed at Normandy on D+1 and then went on to Paris, the Ardennes, crossed the Rhine close to Bonn, and was eventually stationed in both Frankfurt and Munich. By the time he was stationed in Munich, he had been gone for several years, and like other soldiers, hadn't seen his brothers or knew where they were or what had happened to them. One day, while walking down the street, he randomly bumped into his brother Aloysius. It happened that an American reporter was nearby who snapped a picture of the two brothers meeting for the first time in years. At the end of the war, my grandfather was discharged and returned to his childhood sweetheart that he'd married years before. Together, they lived in that same small town for the rest of their lives, rarely apart. They raised 7 children together, and both died within only a few years of each other in their 90s. Today, amongst our most prized possessions are 2 photographs, a weather-beaten picture of a young girl who made her way to New Orleans to marry the man she loved, and another of 2 brothers, both in military uniforms with rifles slung over their shoulders, in a world very different from that small town in Pennsylvania. And that was from Steve Callahan.
I'm David Olusoga, historian and broadcaster.
And I'm Sarah Churchwell, author, journalist, and academic.
And together, we are hosts of Goalhanger's latest podcast, Journey Through Time.
We're going to be looking at hidden social histories behind famous chapters from the past.
Asking what it was like to have lived through Prohibition or to have been there on the ground during the Great Fire of London. We'll be uncovering all of that.
And we'll have characters and stories that have been totally forgotten, but shouldn't have been.
This week, we're looking at a terror attack that shocked New York, that cost American lives, caused millions of dollars of damage to buildings across Manhattan, that led to the establishment of new security agencies, and that helped push the United States towards war.
But it's not 9/11. This is the Black Tom explosion of 1916, the story of a massive sabotage campaign as Germany made a desperate effort to keep America from helping the Allies during the First World War.
And the cast of characters for this story involves Playboy diplomats, there's a stranded sailor, an opera singer who's managing a brothel in New York, and there's a hapless spy who leaves secret documents on a train. So join us on Journey Through Time and hear a clip from the Black Tom story at the end of this episode.
Our next story is from Andy Fagence. My grandfather, Albert Fredericks Fagence, was born in Guildford, Surrey, and grew up nearby with his parents and sister Alice. Before the war, he was a gardener for a family that owned a large house nearby, but in 1939, Albert joined the local ARP and worked in the Guildford control room. In his spare time, he enjoyed drawing caricatures and pictures of some personalities of the time, including Hitler, using Indian ink. We are lucky to still have a book of these in our family's possession. Bert didn't want to join the army, so on January the 14th, 1941, he enlisted in the RAF at RAF Cardington, Bedfordshire. On April the 10th, 1941, their second child was born, a boy who Bert and Rose struggled to decide on a name for. While deliberating while listening to the radio over the airwaves came, "This is the BBC News read by Alvar Liddell," and so the baby boy, my father, was named Alvar. In May 1941, Bert trained as an aircraft hand and ground gunner. In October 1941, he was promoted to Air Craftsman First Class and then to Leading Air Craftsman in December. In February 1942, he was posted to join 615 County of Surrey Squadron, who at this time were to be sent to India with their Hurricane 2s. On arrival, the squadron was stationed at RAF Jessore before moving to RAF Feni and Alipore in Bengal, as well as moving nearer to the Burma front to support operations there, before moving back again to India. During this time in India, Bert had spells of being unwell due to the harsh conditions. In September 1943, he was admitted to the No. 47 General Hospital in Calcutta, suffering from dysentery and sprue. Rose was informed of this and was told to expect him to be repatriated back to England to recover. One morning, Rose had a knock on the door and on opening it was handed a telegram. She was fully expecting to find out when Bert would return home to England, when she was stunned to read the words, "We regret to inform you that your husband, 1225904 LAC Albert Fagans, died of dysentery and sprue at No. 47 General Hospital, India, on the 16th of September, 1943. My grandmother Rose was very fortunate to be able to visit Bert's grave in Bhawanipur, Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery in Calcutta, as part of the Royal British Legion War Widows Pilgrimage Scheme in the late 1980s. One can only imagine her thoughts at the ceremony there after all those years. And that was from Andy Fagence.
Our next story comes from Miles Bing. My mum, Valerie, recently died, and I found her written manuscript and memoir of growing up in London during the war. It's just recently been published as a memoir called London Can Take It. Anyway, she writes, "A vivid memory from school at that time was when we were all called together and a young boy wearing a different school uniform was paraded in front of us. They revealed he was from the Tottenham area, and he looked a bit snivelly with fresh cut marks running up his face. It was clear that he didn't very much want to be there, particularly when a teacher on the low stage pulled up his arm to reveal a freshly bandaged hand with what looked like, could it be, some missing fingers? There was a big speech made warning those assembled about how dangerous and stupid it was to go near or pick up unexploded munitions. Of particular concern were the small hand-sized incendiary devices which were scattered in the thousands every night by our airborne arsonist friends, designed to punch through roofs and set fire to people's lofts. Many of these fell in trees and bushes, some not going off at all, and others were on timer fuses. At school, we had buckets of sand that were meant to be thrown over anything that might drop near us. Nothing very sophisticated. After so many months of suffering, the Blitz had created bands of feral children, usually boys, sneaking out at night and forming little gangs so that they could follow the ARP and fire wardens to precisely where the incendiaries had fallen. It was all the talk of the playground. Collecting shrapnel was one thing, but some of the naughtiest boys would take the heads off the incendiary devices, tip out the magnesium, and then set the contents alight in buckets. Every night could be bonfire night. We'd been warned so many times about such things, and I suppose the school was trying to use shock tactics to make their point. I was still quite young and disturbed by the image of the bandaged boy being manhandled off the stage, already being taken away, presumably to repeat the same exercise at the next school. I couldn't fathom why some boys would actually choose to be outside during an active raid, or to set off explosives. However, as we dispersed back to class, the boys behind me whispered excitedly to each other, and I heard one of them say, "Well, it's only a couple of fingers."
Our last story comes from Eliot Rudnicki. The vast majority of my family was murdered in the Holocaust. My grandparents left a destitute Europe in their late teens, and only a small handful of their large families survived the concentration camps. My step-grandmother, or Bubby in Yiddish as we called her, married my paternal grandfather in 1979. She had known my family for decades, previously having lived in their tight-knit Jewish community in Brooklyn, New York. She even told me stories of pushing my father and uncle around in a perambulator when they were babies. She fitted into our family seamlessly, and over the years would share stories of her escape from Auschwitz by hiding inside the wing of an airplane that was being built before she was tattooed. She even served as a sort of matriarch of the family, and for me, as the focal point for a high school paper I wrote about my Holocaust story. She died about 15 years ago. Then about 6 years ago, a German journalist reached out to my uncle to discuss a woman who'd been searching for her mother. The journalist had written several pieces about her grandparents who raised her, and her unknown mother. He had uncovered that her lost mother was my bubby, who had died a few years prior. My father and my uncle refused to acknowledge the letter. It was written in German and neither had little understanding of what it said. Eventually, I convinced them to share it with me. It turns out my bubby, the woman who spoke Yiddish, knew more about Judaism than many members of our family, who loved us and was a beloved member of the family, was a Nazi. Bubby had married a German man in her early 20s. Her husband became a soldier, and they both became members of the Nazi Party, and were even photographed wearing uniforms and the dreaded red armband. The next part of the story is quite confusing. One night, while her husband was off fighting, she had gone to see a film in the local cinema. While there, her town was bombed. From what we understand, I believe she thought her parents, who were watching her daughter, and her daughter were killed. In what I can only imagine was an overwhelming sense of utter despair, she must have realised there was no life for her in her small German town, and decided to literally start a new life. She somehow became a refugee and claimed that she was a displaced Jew, and eventually arrived in New York and integrated seamlessly into Jewish culture in America. The realisation of my bubby's past was incomprehensible to my father and uncle. It was an existential crisis of beliefs. She was loving and supporting to us, but also had some role in the slaughter of our family. These recriminations translated into a refusal to help an unfortunate lost woman who just wanted information about her mother. As for my bubby, I am torn. I believe she thought her family had perished and decided to move on from a morally bankrupt and evil past that had clearly been revealed as a malignant disease on humanity. But my God, how do you walk away without confirming with certainty your mother, father, and young daughter are truly dead?
That's all for this episode. If you've got a family story you'd like to be considered for the show, please email it to wehavewayspodcast@gmail.com. Please label the email Family Stories so that we don't miss it. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.
Here's that clip we mentioned earlier on.
And gradually what you see in this period is mounting concern over what became called hyphenate Americans, this idea that foreign immigrant communities had divided allegiances. And so there are increasing demands for effectively loyalty tests.
And Wilson gives a very famous speech in which he uses a famous phrase, and that's a phrase that you have spent a long time studying, Sarah. And that is to ask whether these Americans who have loyalties to other nations will, when it comes down to it, whether they will put America first.
And that's the phrase, right? America first. It is a phrase that was first popularized in this context in 1915, a year before Black Tom, in a speech that Wilson gave addressing these mounting concerns about hyphenate Americans, about whether they were real Americans or not. And the way that Wilson put it was, he said, he demanded that immigrant communities stand up and state explicitly whether, he said, is it America first or is it not? And at that point, America First became an incredibly popular phrase. It basically dominates American political discourse for the next decade. Then it kind of subsided, and then it has a resurgence around World War II when it was used to talk about whether America should enter the Second World War. And then it went into abeyance for a long time until it made a dramatic reappearance in the 21st century, which listeners will be familiar with. If you want to hear the full episode, listen to Journey Through Time wherever you get your podcasts.